Good morning and welcome to Fresh Perspectives. I'm Sarah Jacobs. Brown versus the Board of Education, the landmark legislation ordering school desegregation, turns 60. My first guest this morning is Professor Sherrilyn Ifill, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, to talk about the anniversary, work that's been done, work still ahead, as well as an event that will commemorate Brown at 60. Welcome, Professor Ifill.
Thanks for having me.
Brown at 60. For so many people, a monumentous event, but still a monumentous event in our history, even for those who don't remember it. And I guess what I'd like to do is start this morning by just talking about the tremendous impact this had on the fabric of this country.
Well, I'm so glad you put it that way, because I think too many people hear Brown versus Board of Education and they think, okay, it's a Supreme Court decision, and now we're going to talk about education. And yes, it is a Supreme Court decision, and we could talk about education. But if we only limited to that, we would miss the reality of the significance of Brown in shifting this country and shifting American life. I mean, Brown is the beginning of the end of legal apartheid in the United States. And I think, too often what people fail to understand is that before Brown, you do not have an articulation by the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court, affirming the full and equal citizenship of African Americans in this country. The 14th Amendment says that that's what should happen, but it doesn't happen. Instead, we get in 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that you can separate the races, and essentially says that African Americans, that blacks, continue to be inferior to whites. And it is only in 1954 with the Brown decision that the United States Supreme Court says that is not true, that the 14th Amendment means what it says. The 14th Amendment, remember, is ratified in 1868, and it's not until 1954 that it really steps into its true promise. And that's only the beginning, of course, because Brown is the articulation by the Supreme Court. And then we have, the years thereafter, now 60 years, in which we're continuing to still fulfill that promise. But it's really Brown that begins it, and it really is, in many ways, the most important constitutional moment of the 20th century.
And for so many of us, the images of that time are so powerful. The students who were the first to break those color barriers in their schools, that's an image that is still so strong to me that when I think about those people who went through that, the bravery that it really took to take their rightful place in our society.
This country has been a participant in many wars on foreign shores, but we have veterans of the wars that were fought in this country in order to bring about the promise of equality. And the soldiers who fought in those wars were very often young people who had the courage, and their families, to be the pioneers and to take those steps. And most often, I'm sad to say, those young people were not greeted as great heroes, for our country. Instead, too often they were greeted by grown-up people, mobs, spitting at them, yelling at them, denigrating them, threatening them. And we should never forget that. The word patriot is bandied about so loosely these days. But we should never forget these patriots. We should never forget the Little Rock Nine who integrated Central High School. We should never forget, in particular, Elizabeth Eckford, who was outside that school with no one else and an angry white mob howling at her. We should never forget Charlene Gunter Halt and Hamilton Holmes, who integrated the University of Georgia. We should never forget James Meredith, who integrated Ole Miss. And this was a missed riot that broke out in which people were hurt and in some instances killed in order to preserve segregation and to preserve African Americans in a second-class status. We shouldn't forget the Brown family, Linda Brown and her family, and their courage in being lead plaintiffs in the Brown case. There were actually 4 cases that constituted Brown. And in each of those cases, there were courageous families who were willing to put themselves forward. And, of course, the organization that I lead, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was made up of young lawyers who had a vision for what America could be. inspired first by Charles Hamilton Houston, the great visionary and dean at Howard Law School, and then led by Thurgood Marshall, who, of course, later became the first African-American Supreme Court justice, Robert Carter, Spotswood Robinson, Oliver Hill, Lou Redding, Jack Greenberg, Constance Baker Motley. These were amazing, brilliant, pioneering lawyers, themselves African-American, with the exception of Jack Greenberg, who could see an America that they had never experienced and who had the intellectual heft and the discipline to engage in a strategy that really stretched over 20 years, beginning in 1935, and that led up to Brown.
I was just going to bring that up. That really, Brown, the Brown decision was not just this little single moment in time. There were decades leading up to it, and there have been decades since that struggle has been going on.
Well, one of the important things to celebrate about Brown is to understand how change can happen. Brown was part of a strategy that was developed in the 1930s, and it began first with a successful challenge to segregation at the University of Maryland Law School in Baltimore. Thurgood Marshall was from Baltimore. I actually have taught at University of Maryland Law School for 20 years and been on the faculty. And it was Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston who won the case desegregating that school. And they continued on challenging other universities, beginning first with higher education, but always intending to get to K through 12 education, which they did in Brown. So one of the things to notice and to celebrate is the brilliance of this 20-year legal strategy, the patience to execute it, the willingness to stay the course. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we did not give due attention to the resistance to the Brown decision, which began, frankly, within days of the decision, when Governor Talmadge from Georgia said, there aren't enough troops in the United States to make us integrate, to make us have white children go to school with black children. And the resistance, was organized. Massive resistance was what it was called. It was a term coined by the governor of Virginia. The Southern Manifesto, signed by so many United States congressmen refusing to implement Brown, declaring their intention to refuse to implement Brown in violation of the United States Supreme Court. Whites all over the South pulling their kids out of public school, sending them to private academies that were created and supported by public money until lawsuits stopped them from doing so. And then, of course, maybe the most egregious and awful example in Prince Edward County, Virginia, of closing the public schools for 5 years rather than integrate. And so the concerted effort to ensure that the promise of Brown would not be fulfilled at the cost of the integrity of our public education system is something that should never be forgotten.
Reading your reflections on Brown at 60, you talk about still being in the fight, that LDF continues to fight for quality education for the most marginalized children. Talk about that for a moment.
Well, we have to recognize that the promise of Brown, it remains unfulfilled in some ways. There are many people who benefited from Brown, and as I stated, if we see Brown globally, we understand simply by being the beginning of the end of legal apartheid, it changed America. I don't think we have the first African-American president, Barack Obama, without Brown versus Board of Education. And there are many people who benefited from Brown, myself included. However, there are many people who continue to struggle in an education system that is substandard. And the disproportionate number of those are people of color or children of color. And we continue to believe it is our job to make sure that the door stays open. In fact, that we push the door open even wider to make sure that all children get through the door. What the Supreme Court said in the Brown case was that education is the foundation of good citizenship. And in 1954, the Supreme Court said it's impossible to imagine an American child having success without a proper education. Well, if that was true in 1954, it is certainly true in 2014, and the Supreme Court recognized that. So we regard it as the legal right of every child to have a quality education in America. And so we continue to fight for that at multiple levels. We continue to monitor, frankly, many jurisdictions in the South where we litigated desegregation cases, and our seat at the table allows us to advocate for and fight for the resources that children need in their schools.
And some of those stories are shocking. I've just recently been reading about some of those school districts in the Deep South, and it's unbelievable for those of us who maybe live in excellent school districts that this does go on every day in this country.
Well, if there's one thing I hope that comes out of the commemoration of Brown and the reflection about this effort is to have people understand, really what is happening in America. And I think, unfortunately, one of the difficulties of the success of Brown, because while the full promise of Brown has not been realized, there's a lot of the progeny of Brown that has produced success for so many people. And it's allowed too many people to turn a blind eye to the needs that still exist out there. And it allows too many people to pretend or to allow themselves to believe that we still do not have segregated school districts, that our country is not still deeply segregated in terms of housing, which frankly at LDF we regard as one of the major issues still yet to be addressed, which is entirely connected to the question of school desegregation. Look, if we did not live in segregated housing, we would not have segregated schooling. And America still remains deeply segregated. So we still have a lot of work to do. And, I've been saying for the, last few months that civil rights is the work of democracy maintenance. And I've been saying that because I believe that civil rights is the work in which if you are a citizen of this country, you are obligated to be involved. It is not my work because I'm a civil rights lawyer, or it's not the work just of African Americans or Latinos or other minorities. Every person who has the privilege of being a citizen in this country should regard themselves as a soldier in the battle for full civil rights and for equality and justice. And I hope that the commemoration of Brown will encourage many people to see themselves as part of that ongoing struggle.
Sherrilyn Ifill is president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and this nation is commemorating Brown versus the Board of Education, Brown at 60. And there's an event coming up that I'd like to draw attention to. And why don't you share with us how we are celebrating and commemorating Brown at 60?
Well, there are lots of opportunities for people to get involved. I would love for people to go to our website, www.naacpldf.org. That's naacpldf.org. And people should recognize that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is a separate organization from the NAACP and has been for 50 years. But what you should recognize is that if you go to our website, you can get all kinds of resources. So schools can begin to teach about Brown. We've got, the decisions. We've got archival material. We've got audio material, all on our website. We're having an event on May 16th. May 17th is actually Brown Day. It falls on a Saturday this year. On the Friday before that Saturday, we'll be having an event in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. We'll be having a conversation between the two only elected African-American governors since Reconstruction. That's current Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick and former Virginia Governor Doug Wilder, both members of the Legal Defense Fund family. Deval Patrick was actually a lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund before he was governor of Massachusetts. And Governor Wilder was a cooperating attorney with LDF attorneys in Virginia. And that conversation will be moderated by journalist Charlene Gunter Halt, excuse me.
Hunter Galt.
Hunter Galt, right, who was the student I referred to earlier who desegregated the University of Virginia. She wanted a journalism degree and had wanted to be a journalist from the time she was 8 years old and wanted to go to her state school. And she had to battle. She was represented by LDF, and she was escorted into the school amidst a howling mob, and she got her journalism degree, and many of us know her to be a brilliant journalist. So that'll be that conversation. We're also recognizing and honoring Mrs. Cecilia Marshall, the widow of Thurgood Marshall, who in her own right worked at the NAACP and has really been a supporter, remains on the board of the Legal Defense Fund, and has been a champion for justice herself. And we'll also be joined that day, we're very thrilled to hear, by Attorney General Eric Holder. And that is at the National Press Club. It'll be a luncheon at noon. And again, you can get information by going to the NAACPLDF.org website. And folks can also follow me on Twitter and just look up my name, Sherrilyn Ifill, and my Twitter handle will come up. And you can follow me and get additional information about our Brown celebration.
A wonderful celebration it is. You've inspired me to go to the website and check out that archival information. I know I'm going to enjoy reading through that, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. Could you give that website one more time?
Sure. It's www.naacplds.org. That's naacplds.org. I think you could also get to it by Brown at 60. It will bring you to the link as well if you Google Brown at 60. And we're really looking forward to having lots of visitors to the site and really helping people have the material that they need to really fully understand the importance of this incredible decision moment, change moment in the history of this country.
Sherrilyn Ifill, president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It's an honor to have you on the show this morning to talk about this.
Thanks so much.
When we return, Judelin Lilly from the Civil Rights Summit in Austin, Texas. You're listening to Fresh Perspectives.